come over to you now because it's a very inspiring story from Prashant, and it also ties into an experience I think you had last year in a Delhi restaurant, which we carried on NDTV, and we interviewed you about it when you said there were restaurants who were just not friendly towards your wheelchair. They didn't allow you access. They were embarrassed by your presence in their space. Tying in many issues that Prashant is talking about. One is, of course, opportunity, acceptance, and prejudice. I mean, you are a champion for the rights of people who are differently abled. What are the challenges you face, and how does an experience like Mirchi and mine perhaps fit into
No, I completely agree with you. I think attitudes are one of the biggest challenges that people with disabilities across this country face. You mentioned the incident last year, that's why I'll talk about it again. It was in 6 months last year that I was actually denied entry with this restaurant because they said that as a policy we don't allow the disabled inside, and I tweeted about it, and the issue kind of exploded with it becoming a breaking news on NDTV and all other news channels, etc. What also happened because of that is that a lot of positive did come out of it also, because I remember contacting Zomato after that, and Zomato added a wheelchair access filter to restaurants, and what that filter does is that it not only identifies what restaurants are wheelchair accessible, but it also changes attitudes of restaurants towards people with disabilities. So attitudes are of course a big challenge, and I think attitudes are a challenge not just in restaurants but in public policy too. For example, the odd even is on again. The first stage of odd even when it was starting in January, the Delhi government actually forgot to exempt people with disabilities from the odd even, despite the transport infrastructure that Delhi currently has. And I know at least 10 people with disabilities who wrote to the Delhi government but did not really get a positive response. Eventually, I actually had to take the High Court's intervention to exempt people with disabilities from odd even. So attitudes are a challenge both in the private sector and in the government. And what Prashant is doing is something wonderful. There are a lot of other companies also that have realized the business case for hiring people with disabilities. One of the inspiring stories that I often talk about is this courier company in Bombay that actually realized that when you're delivering a courier to somebody, the courier boy doesn't really need to communicate with somebody. So why not have all hearing impaired people? There's this it started by this Oxford graduate called Dhruv Thakra, who actually came back to India and started this company called Miracle Couriers, and it has the lowest attrition amongst all courier companies in the country. So I think there's a business case for hiring people with disabilities, and in terms of policy, yeah, attitudes definitely need to change.
Right. Order for that push to be given to include people into the mainstream. And you were talking about how basic United Nations guidelines are not being followed currently in the country either.
Yeah, in fact, India, the current law in motion is the Persons with Disability Act that came up in 1995 in the country, and India actually signed the United Nations Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disability in 2007, and India was supposed to follow that up with another law that would have strengthened systems in India and mandated at least government infrastructure to become accessible. Today, even government buildings in India are not accessible. I don't know whether you've ever gone to Delhi Secretariat, but there's a huge staircase leading up inside. I actually went. I was invited to give a report there, and the place I was invited to give a report to was itself not accessible. But the government can do a lot. I mean, building codes can be changed. Other than that, whenever there's any commercial enterprise in the private sector that's set up, it requires a completion certificate, and that completion certificate requires a fire NOC and a couple of other NOCs. So why not add an accessibility NOC too? And what that will do is that won't only help people with disabilities in India, but that will also help the elderly population. India is one of the fastest growing elderly population. Over 8% of India's population today, as per the census, is elderly. And even though the census says that 2.21% of India's population is disabled, WHO says 15% of the world's population is disabled. So I guess truth lies somewhere in the middle. So you're talking about 15 to 20% of this country's population for which life will be much easier. I had this friend of mine who recently had a fracture, and she actually texted me that now I know how difficult life is for you traveling around the city because I have a fracture. So temporary injuries keep coming up all the time too. So accessibility is something that is necessary. The government has started this Accessibility India campaign, which I guess Mr. Aziz we might speak a bit about. But the unfortunate thing is the Accessibility India campaign only talks about only talks about making government buildings accessible. That anyway should be done. I think what is needed is to incentivize the private sector to make private buildings accessible.
Yeah.
Today, as per the CSR law, you can donate money to make a garden or a public building accessible, but you cannot really use your CSR funds to make your own infrastructure accessible. So why not give the private sector a carrot too in trying to you spend your own CSR funds to make your own institution accessible. Right. So a lot can be done, but
yeah, Shazia.
I think unfortunately, it starts from the top, the depiction of culture, people with disabilities in popular culture, where your prime minister calls you Divyang or a divine soul, as Divyang is called. I guess it will be very difficult for me to go to a bar now and order a drink because divine people, I guess, are not allowed to order a drink. But I think
you can call it Somras.
But I think what's needed is that for the society to realize that people with disabilities are perfectly grey characters.
Yeah.
With their own interests, their own likes. They can be good, they can be bad, they can cheat people, they can help people, but they're complete individuals and they do not really require sympathy. But what they instead require is empathy. Often, when I go to a market, something people start pushing my wheelchair around. I feel like telling them that I'm not a merry-go-round that you need to start pushing my wheelchair around.
I'll manage, thank you. Yeah.
So maybe they're trying to help, but at instances it can really seem offensive also. The terminology itself is of course very bad. Other than disability, other than Divyang, there's another very often used term called differently abled. And what I like to tell people is that everybody is differently abled and has some characteristic of the other. So I think it's just important to realize that people with disabilities are normal human beings. They just have a certain constraint. And let me describe what's really happened in the Western world. In the Western world, actually, the way disability is looked at has changed. It's moved from a medical problem where disability is looked at as at an individual level, whether a person has arthrogryposis like me, autism, etc., to a social model. And the social model basically means that it's the barriers that exist in society, whether in attitudes, law, or infrastructure that are the
divide. Yeah.
So I think India needs to move towards a social model too, and that's what.
Right. Shazi, wanted to come in? Nipun, as an activist, are you happy at all with the way policy is being implemented or addressed as far as these issues are concerned?
No, if you look at the three big newses in the disability sector last year, one of them was that Ira Singhal was appointed as a brand ambassador of the Accessible India campaign because she got the first rank in the civil services. What people do not know is that in 2010 she cracked the civil services too, but the medical board had not allowed her a posting saying that a person with a disability is not fit enough to become a district magistrate. She had to prove it by topping the civil services, and I think that is a shame. Another big news in the disability, from the government in terms of disability, was that Arunima Sinha was received a Padma Shri because she climbed Mount Everest, and she's the first female amputee to climb Mount Everest. But what most people here would not know is that the Paralympic Committee of India has been banned by the International Paralympic Association because of too much politics in it and the way it's one professionally run. Another issue was that there was this person with a 95% disability called Banti Dada, who was really congratulated with the government. The government gave him a job at Sector 2 because he'd completed a PhD from JNU despite his hardships. But every year, seats in Delhi University for people with disabilities open, and out of 1,300 seats, not more than 600 really get filled. So I think this government, previous governments have got into the habit of looking at people with disabilities as an inspirational porn, as I like to use the word, where they target a few individuals and celebrate their victories rather than creating big change on ground. I mean, just because I'm living a normal life should not be celebrated because I have to go through those hardships to lead that normal life. But in fact, the government should make it easier for a person like me to lead a normal life. And I don't think I've got any assurance from the representative of the government sitting here on whether the disability bill will be passed and converted into law. So,
but you do have divinity.
Sorry?
I said, but you do have divinity. You may not have an assurance,
of
but
course.
you have divinity. Okay. All right. Anybody?